Chapter 1. The Burwood Forest was unusually cold, even for an early October morning. The clouds hung lower than normal, held aloft by skeletal treetops. Only the most tenacious leaves still held on to their branches. Some would consider this a sign of inspiration, these few heroic flags still flapping. But the brutal truth was, they could not hold forever. Years of neglect had taken its toll on the forest. The old trotting paths were overgrown, and the trees had been left to push their way through the wood fencing, which was on the brink of being entirely swallowed, save for a few stubborn posts. At the edge of the woods, a crude structure had been erected out of mismatched planks of rotting wood. Most of the material was stolen from neighboring barns, made evident by the peeling red paint speckled randomly throughout the structure's exterior. It reached almost as high as the trees that helped support it. Unmeasured angles gave it an awkward stance. The roof leaned heavily to one side, as if its spine had twisted. It resembled an upturned coffin, peering out over the Davidson's field left desolate after the harvest. Despite the huge opening at the front of the structure, it allowed no light. There were impenetrable shadows embedded within that resisted the prying day, the kind of absolute darkness found in the ocean's depths. It held on to the night, and perhaps was even the origin of it. Kneeling at the base of the structure was a man with his eyes turned up to meet the highest point of the temple, his hands stretched out in unabashed praise. A terrible tremor had taken hold of his body. He was no older than 30, yet looked hardened by a life of heavy labor. His complete nakedness, save for the light layers of dirt coating his unwashed body, revealed the intricate scars that patterned his skin. They spread from the base of his neck, covering every inch of him like tally marks. They traced down his back and across his shoulders, wrapped around his arms and chest, cutting into the crevices of his armpits before continuing down his torso. Even the sensitive flesh of his groin was not spared the meticulous and mysterious documentation. The only blank canvas left was his face, but that was mostly hidden by a wild beard. The oddest thing of all was his expression of bliss. A gleeful smile stretched out across his face in joyous defiance against the gloom. It was pure adulation that poured out of him, not sorrow, not terror. Kneeling in front of the imposing structure, he could offer only love and worship. His whole body tingled with it. He fixated on the dark opening like a dead thing glimpsing heaven for the first time. Thoughts drifted through the light blue of his eyes, and although his pupils remained pinned in place, his irises toiled and drifted just as the clouds above. In the oblivion gaping before him, he found completeness and order. He seemed to feast on it, as if it was something he hungered for. The man with spectral eyes was waiting for his master. Then, from deep within the Burwood Forest, something stirred. Chapter 2. The cat's little paw had just finished twitching by the time Clara scrambled out of her minivan. Her eyes were reluctant to look, but she felt obligated to suffer the damage she had caused. It was far worse than she had allowed herself to imagine. The animal had burst, its body reduced to an unrecognizable splash of flesh and fur. She did manage to identify a piece that looked like its head perched near her left turn signal. It was grimacing like a gargoyle. "Oh, dang this day," she mourned, crossing her arms. She was already late, and now she had this on her conscience. Every Sunday morning, Clara rose to the task of prepping St. Paul's United Church for the day's worship. She had been doing this ever since she returned from Teachers College 10 years ago. In all that time, never once was the service held up because of her, until, she feared, this dang day. It was not entirely her fault. The family of feral cats had been playing recklessly near the edge of Highway 7. The tragedy was inevitable. Clara was just thankful it was the mother she hit, and not one of the kittens. If it were a baby she had to scrub off her bumper, she might have just turned around and driven back home.
Any day that starts with killing a kitten is a day not worth starting. She rummaged through her van for something to clean with, but all she found was a collapsed box of tissues. She decided they would have to do. As she brushed off the bones and soaked up the blood, a few cars tore past her down the highway at a speed Clara found more than a little excessive. At one point, the wind from a car almost tipped her over. Briefly, she pictured what she might look like splashed across a hood. Very briefly. The highway, which had only recently been paved, could lead you to one of two places. Either you were heading to church, or you were escaping. Far away. Judging by how fast the cars tore up the pavement, Clara assumed they were not searching for God. Everyone was in a rush to find a way out. No one was in a rush to find the Lord. Clara neatly piled what remained of the cat by the side of the highway and offered it a moment of silence. Once she was satisfied due respect had been paid, Clara jumped back into her minivan. The church was waiting, and she had taken far too much time. As she shifted the gear from park to drive, she noticed the half-eaten chocolate chip muffin sitting in the cup holder. To call it a muffin was a bit of a stretch. After all, it was more closely related to a cupcake than an actual muffin. It would be, at best, a third cousin twice removed. It was the same muffin she was taking a bite out of the exact moment the cat chose to cross the road. She knew as soon as she bought it that morning that she was going to regret it, and she was right. Before driving off, she tossed it into the field where she imagined the kittens might be congregating. They were going to need it more than she did, she reasoned. As she roared into the dirt parking lot of the church, she took note of the time, 20 minutes later than usual. She had to move fast. She yanked at her seatbelt, but somewhere along the way, the strap had burrowed itself under her left breast. This was a constant annoyance for her and her generous bust. Gradually, the strap was wiggled loose and she was finally free. She hastily climbed the stone steps of St. Paul's United Church. As always, the heavy dark wood of the front door greeted her with a satisfying creak. She had precious little time to appreciate it, though. Her fellow church members could be arriving any minute, and there was much to be done.
Chapter 3. His fingers clawed at the dry leaves. He crushed them in his fists and let the pain dig deep. The man with spectral eyes had been forced to his hands and knees by the wound freshly opened down the length of his back. It followed his spine all the way from his shoulders to his buttocks. Despite its depth, there was little blood. The thin gash had been perfectly placed. It completed his tapestry, as if each of his scars had been leading to this masterstroke. His breath was slow to return to him, but once he could inhale without his entire torso stinging, he took in as much air as he could, and the air took him in as well, surrounding him, swallowing his entire body. The hungry breeze chased through the trees and rose with him as he got to his feet. He let the cooling touch of the air wrap around him and ease the burning of his wound. The wind brought life back into the woods, but it wasn't the life it once knew. Leaves rustled and branches swayed, but not because of the hustle and bustle of animals. That life was long gone. A presence had invaded and snuffed it out. Now there was only the wind shaking the remnants of what life had been. The man took a step forward and peered through the maze of twisting bark. He looked out from the heart of the woods and saw all the way to its fringes where the forest ended and the field began. Then he looked beyond even that. He saw a little country church by the side of a highway and a little woman getting it ready. Revelation bloomed in his eyes and filled his thoughts as if the woods themselves whispered to him. His path had been revealed, and he was obliged to follow.